Great. Welcome, everybody. We see you streaming in, so we're just going to give it a minute to get started. Bill, you good? You watching everyone roll in here?
I'm good. I'm watching it. Yeah.
Okay, good.
Thanks,
Make sure I
Jody.
have perfect. It's great. Well, do you want to? We can start with introductions while folks are streaming in if you want.
Let's do that. Do you want
Well,
to start or you want me to, Jody?
you can start since you're in charge of this group.
Uh, you're never in charge of this group, but anyway, thank you everyone for joining. We've got a strategic arrangement here, strategy with the J.Thelander group, both Jody and Morgan. So, we think this could be helpful to the companies that we help accelerate each year to, really establish and set what the proper compensation guidelines are, but to use them more as incentives to drive your businesses, generate revenue, and move towards commercialization. So, we've always been impressed with, the presentations that we've seen and everything. So, this hopefully is the first in several opportunities to expose the good work that the J.Thelander Group does to our ecosystem.
Perfect. Well, my name is Morgan J.Thelander. I am the COO at J.Thelander Consulting. And if you've ever participated in our compensation survey, then you have heard from me in one way, shape, or form. Which
Great. And I
Jody
am,
leaves
yeah,
you.
I'm Jody. I'm going to turn to get rolling here. So I'm Jody J.Thelander. So part of why we're here today is to talk about compensation and sort of the Comp 101. And I'm going to jump right into a little bit of data. And we would love this to be interactive. It's a nice group of us. So please feel free to put your questions in the chat because Morgan's monitoring that and she'll raise them so that we can, spend a little more time on whatever your priorities are. But by way of background, we survey private companies across all aspects of compensation. And we're always proud that our data is used in all these media outlets, Fortune, Forbes, PitchBook, Wall Street Journal, Term Sheet, all the, usual suspects in terms of the private capital markets. We also have a great podcast, which you might find really helpful because we've had Caplander, all things private capital markets, and we've had a host of VCs and very successful, mostly life science CEOs. We just had on a woman who sold her company to, I guess it was AbbVie in a $2 billion deal, Laura Shaver. And we've had some other interesting people on. So, and a partner from NEA and other firms that can sort of give you the lay of the land of what they're thinking about in terms of fundraising and their priorities in their own careers and business. And then we'll get a little bit into the real-time data. Maybe Morgan, do you want to talk about sort of how the model works and where this all this data comes from for today?
Definitely. So we collect all of our data, as Jody mentioned, through a compensation survey. It's open year round, so we'll put the link in the chat and you'll be able to participate. But it's a give to get model, and it's pure in the sense that when you participate and if you get access to all of the job titles you complete for no cost. So we're going to say that again slowly. So if you input data for your 5 or 10 existing employees, you will get real-time data back for the exact job titles you completed information for. And it's no
Yeah.
cost, 12 months of access, and all the data that Jody will be showing today was pulled from the J.Thelander platform.
Yeah, so let's talk about the different comp levers so that we're all on the same page because this is really important. And Bill, feel free to jump in here if you have an interpretation of something that everyone should know. So we look at cash compensation for private companies as a base salary and then a current bonus, which is a bonus that was actually received. And we look at that both as a number as well as a percentage of base salary. And then we also survey the target bonus, which is the bonus out on the horizon, both as a dollar amount as well as a percentage of base salary. And that gets you to total cash. And in the J.Thelander world, we look at total cash as a combination of base salary and the bonus that was paid, or just if there's no bonus that was paid, just base salary. And then there are three different types of equity. One is founder shares. And there's really, if we had a lawyer on right now, they would tell you there's no one true definition of a founder, but we consider that the person who really started the company. And then a founder can get additional equity past their founder shares for the role that they're in. So let's say you're a founder CEO or chief medical officer, and you get your initial equity grant and then you get additional equity. You can get additional equity because you're staying on as the CEO or CMO or whatever role. And that is a completely different bucket than non-founder equity. And that's the person who's hired to come in. And it's really important. So let's look right now at CEO compensation by experience. This is just to give you an idea. So this is for a company. The best way to look at comp data, is really important that everyone pays close attention to this. I really wanted to stick is by the total amount of financing that you've raised, because nothing is more important than that for the impact on cash and equity. Bill, do you have thoughts on that?
Well, yeah, I think you're right. And a lot of times people look at companies by revenue, but that doesn't really take into effect those early stage companies that still aren't in commercialization, especially in medtech. So, it's always been financing is a good rule of thumb on that, and obviously demonstrates the cash availability of the company and the ability to pay compensation and equity. So.
Yeah, I'm going to show another slide. This one, I'm going to go back to the other one by experience. So this is series versus total financing versus headcount. And notice we didn't even put revenue in here. I mean, I have a client right now where we did revenue because they are in a, more of a tech related space and they are revenue generating. And it was important for the board. And we looked at that for cash. But I'll tell you, when it came to equity, we still looked at the total amount of financing because it was more consistent data. So here's CEO median compensation. And Morgan, is this all industries?
This is actually life sciences only.
Okay, perfect. So this is a first-time CEO by the 15 to 50 million in total financing, and then or less than 25 people. So you can see it's sort of interesting. So you can also notice that the base pay plus the bonus does not equal total cash, and that's for the exact reason that we explained that not every company is awarding a bonus. So the total cash could just be base pay, but you can see much more consistent at the 15 to 50 of total financing, founder total equity, and then non-founder equity. And again, the founder total equity could be the original founder's grant, and then it may include additional equity. And then here is the median compensation. This comes from our planning tool. Maybe Morgan, you can explain this one. And again, this is life sciences.
This is actually going to be all.
Okay.
Yeah. This is one of my favorite new tools that we have. And so one of the things that we do besides providing real-time compensation data is we use all of our own data to consult. And that's really what all of the consulting work that comes out of the business is done by Jody and her team. But this shows how as the total amount of financing increases on the bottom, which is less than 5 million, 15 to 29, et cetera, how the mix of total cash and non-founder equity is the orange line on the bottom, and then the total founder equity is the blue line, how the mix changes as a company raises capital.
Or really, the other thing is that not only how it changes, but how maybe it doesn't change, because you
Right.
can see that the non-founder equity is still hovering around 5%. So Bill, maybe you want to explain from a board member and an investor standpoint, right? Because there can be dilution, but then there is additional equity going, given to CEOs. So what are you seeing with your companies?
Well, I think first of all, Jody, just going back for a moment and filling out the survey for everybody that's on here, this is great. It doesn't take long. We've done it before, and this information is invaluable. Um, I think the starting point that we recommend with all companies is they have a compensation philosophy, first of all.
Right.
Otherwise, what you find yourself doing is negotiating with every new employee, whatever it is you want. And there's a lot of fairness there's a lot of inequality in something like that. As far as the equity, what we're seeing more towards right now is options versus RSUs. But the equity going down through the ranks of the company is fairly significant in early stage startups. And I think on one hand, there's a group of CEOs that may overstate what that equity is worth, which that's never going to work out well. And in many other instances, there's CEOs that understate it and don't reflect and show the right value. So, we always recommend, and one of the things that I've always believed in going back years is that you need to be in that middle of where a reasonable opportunity is for people to understand what the equity is that they'll derive, and what their role is going to be to unleash that equity and eventually sell the company or whatever change is going to unleash that.
Yeah, and I think you're totally right about a comp philosophy because it is really important for with a comp philosophy is that you understand that the compensation is not the same for every single role because it depends on what role is important to the company, the value of that role to the organization, the value of that job, the contribution, and also the individual who's in it because not everybody is at the same stage of their career. So you could have somebody who's coming into a title and they're very senior. So they may be at the 75th percentile for their total cash and 75th percentile for their equity. You may have someone who's coming into a role who's very junior. They've got a lot of growth trajectory in that title, and they may be 50th percentile on their total cash and 25th percentile on their equity. But you want to be able to talk about why and have a comp philosophy and a structure that makes sense. Let's move in for a
Jody,
second.
hey,
Oh, go
Jody, if I
ahead.
could just add on one thing on that, I think
Yeah.
it's important also that a comp philosophy and a structure isn't a specific number; it's a range. So
Yeah.
it's a range in salary, it's a range in incentive earnings from that standpoint that allows you to customize a bit without negotiating everything. It at least gives you the rails, and then you could decide where that employee fits based on tenure and experience and all of that.
I like ranges a lot because I think that it also helps you work with the board, and that's really important. I'm going to pull up this slide. Hang
I
on,
have
here we
a
go.
question too, and I this comes up a lot is when is the right time for a company to put these ranges in place and put formality in place, especially around the compensation philosophy and structure?
Right. And it's never, hang on, I'm going to pull this up. 28, Morgan,
Yeah,
here.
I don't know that it's ever too early, Morgan, although if you've got three employees, it probably doesn't make sense. But I think once you start to reach an employee count, approaching 8 or 9 or 10 employees, and things become a little bit more complex, you need something like that in place. Yeah, something that's beyond that first wave of hires that you have.
I would argue that it needs to be even sooner, that it should be once you're a founder of a company and you've got any employee coming on, the best thing for you to do is, well, here's a slide that we put in, is to ask yourself these questions. To ask yourself, what are your priorities? What compensation levers you going to use? You're going to use a base salary and a bonus, or you're just going to use the base salary? And I really recommend you just use the base salary for as long as you can because getting into the bonus and the milestones is tricky and it's done for an annual basis and a bonus isn't a guarantee, but then people want to know what they're measured up against. What's the peer group to use? And that would be your industry for some roles and your total amount of financing without question. And then, Bill, as you're saying, sort of what is your approach? Because even if you don't have a lot of money up front, right, and that the fundraising is really going to be challenging because it is, and so you're more equity driven. My assumption is that if you raise cash, that at some point you're going to have more cash and you're going to be very close to the vest with the equity, and that's really what's important, is to make sure that you think about that as it goes into your option pool. So let's move. There's so many things to touch on, and I know we don't have a lot of time, but
And that's a great point, Jody, is that initially you're going to be cash lean and equity rich, and then you're going to shift that as you become successful for any number of reasons.
yeah, and you're not going to be able to give everybody additional equity. So you want to make sure you do it right in the beginning. And this is sort of a guide for that in terms of the option pool. So you got to back the truck up and make sure you have a strategic perspective. What's your comp philosophy? Where are you now? And if you're going to make a trade-off and give someone high equity and lower cash, it's good to still know what, if you had more cash, what would that job turn into over time in terms of the right mix? And how does that dovetail into your option pool? So this is for all data, but just to know the different buckets. One is a founder's bucket, and the 25th, 50th, and 75th percentile numbers are really predicated on how many founders you have. So if you just have one, you're probably at the lower end. And if you have multiple, you're probably at the higher end. Then you have an employee option pool, which is the main thing to keep your eye on here. And that's showing that the employee option pool is somewhere in that 10 to about 15, 16%. The board member bucket here is for outside board members. So if you have like a scientific advisory board or people coming who are not investors, and then of course the investor bucket. But here's the thing, and it's the same globally, right? Because we're doing a lot of consulting and have data for the UK and the rest of Europe, and it's staying pretty consistent, really 10 to 15%. And then here is for an early stage company, which is, I know, sort of where most of you are, if you are in the somewhere either seed stage financing or in that 5 to 15. And as you would expect, founders own more. But the thing I really want you to take away here, so when you head into a board meeting and you're planning, is that the option pool is still around 10 to 15%. So this is sort of compensation 101, is that your equity pool, your option pool should be 10 to 15%. And then the board members, outside board members, the same. And you can see the investors don't own quite as much. And then if you move into the next stage of financing, the founders have gotten diluted. Again, the key takeaway, the option pool is still in that 10 to 16%, and the investors own more. So as you know, if you're going to, and the employee option pool is, here is another piece of this that's important to remember. That option pool should be allocated for future, the future option plan granted annually in refresh, and also for new hires. So I'm going to take a pause here. Morgan, what does everyone always ask about in terms of the refresh?
When do you refresh? Who do you refresh? How often do you refresh? I mean,
How
how
much do you
much do you yeah,
refresh? Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah. And the answer to that is, which is why we're here, is it really depends. And it depends on how good of a job you did in the first place, giving the right amount of equity, and how thoughtful you were, knowing that maybe, as you said, Bill, in the beginning, you've got more equity because you haven't raised capital. And so as you raise capital, then of course the equity becomes more valuable and you don't want to give as much of it out. And at some point, if you've given somebody too much and they get diluted down, you may say, okay, you got diluted, but you're still at the right place. Now, if you didn't give somebody enough equity and they got diluted down, because you saw those numbers for a non-founder CEO staying pretty consistent around 5%. So that means if you didn't give somebody enough and they're below that 5%, or somehow you ended up in uncharted territory, then you're going to have to give more equity to that person. So the goal is to get it right and be really thoughtful, which again drives into why you should participate, because you want to have the data for your jobs, and that way you can see where you should be on your equity. So that the whole refresh is really predicated on how good of a job you did in the beginning, the value of that role to the organization, and then your mix between cash and equity. So Bill, maybe we can get into the equity real quick, because you were asking questions on this. So let's take a look here about the different types of equity.
Yep.
One
So
of the things about this too, in terms of the equity piece, and this has come up with podcast guests in particular, especially as the company does raise more capital and you do look to refresh people, you might not refresh everybody with equity. That's also where the cash comes in as another valuable compensation lever.
right, because the equity is really reserved. Maybe early on in a company, you're going to give everybody equity, but it is unlikely that you're going to be able to continue that all the way through the life cycle of your fundraising and your company's success. Because at a certain point, that option pool is going to be very dear, and you're not going to be able. You have maybe move to like 50 or 75 employees. You're not going to be able to give everybody a refresh grant.
Yeah. What about, and just one more question on this, I know it comes up a lot, is that there historically has been more of a trade-off between the cash and the equity. Are you seeing that trade-off still exist, or are you seeing people go after both?
Well, that's a great question. Bill, what's your thought?
Yeah, well, I think an employee wants to go after both, of course, but I think that's where setting this correctly up front, where maybe you're going to be 80 or 85% of what the appropriate cash compensation is in your early stage of your company, but you're going to give equity, to compensate for that or offset that and higher, and then move it from that standpoint. I think at the end of the day, it's also board members too. I would just caution everybody, and I'm on several boards. A board member always comes in and asks for a retainer. I'd stay away from that. I think board members, at some point that
You mean
works.
a cash retainer they
Yeah,
asked for?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah.
I mean that works as you grow and at some point in the future. But you could really utilize board members great with the right incentives from equity shares.
Yeah,
Whether
so two different areas on that. So my thought is that an early stage employee is likely going to be compensated more with equity than cash. But
Yes.
that will only last so long because in today, and I've just been working with a colleague of mine who took a job as a chief medical officer for a company, and she wanted the high cash and high equity. And I think that every employee is going to, if they're smart, are going to go for both. And that you, as the leadership of the company, is going to have to decide who is worth doing that for. Because the problem is in today's market, as we know, the liquidity is taking longer. They're fewer and far between. And so there's no longer that feeling of this go-go.com days or, in life sciences that companies are getting in and getting out. It's a long game and it's a haul and people have to live. So you got to figure out where your resources are and what jobs you can give that to. But the trade-off part is really, I think, less prevalent today.
Yeah,
Yeah.
and I think that's true, Jody. And I mean, when you really look at that, that trade-off and the time, it is taking longer. It's taking longer. And as you said on previous podcasts, or previous webinars, just the act of venture funding right now, venture is taking longer. So if you're an LP, if you're a partner, if you're a general partner, it's taking longer to see those companies materialize. And I think everybody on this call would probably agree with that.
Yeah.
So
We were
you know,
talking
you are going to have to match cash at some point to
We were
retain
talking
your.
about this, getting ready for Jody has a panel next week at Investival, which is a startup showcase in London. And we were looking at the fundraising data. PitchBook's latest report said that mega rounds have gotten so much more prevalent because the crossover rounds are getting smaller or not existing at all. And so much of that is exactly what you're saying. And they talked about for biotech companies who have really historically relied on those bridge rounds. It's not, you have to raise more money at one time so that you can extend your runway for as long as possible.
Yeah, we're working with a client right now, and this founder CEO said when they raised this capital, they're in the 90 to 120 million mark now, and they went from being in the 15 million to up to this 90 million plus. And as he said, the investors took their pound of flesh. And so they're all sideways in terms of their equity right now. And the founder CEO really backed down sort of for the greater good of the team, which was very genuine in his intention, but it really sort of screwed him up because now he's got to play catch up. So I feel like, my best guidance to you is to plan because you're not doing anybody favors if you have the number one sort of take a back seat and think that it's going to all work out because you're still going to have to write it. And to do that when the distance between where the gap between where you are and where the market is too wide, it's really tough to do that. I'm going to wind up with one last section here on non-investor board comp since Bill touched upon it. So I know it's an interesting area, and I'd rather leave you all wanting more information from us anyhow. So we maybe get invited back or you participate. So non-investor board comp is very interesting. There are multiple ways that you can compensate your outside board members. And these are the different levers. Just like the different comp levers for the employees, are the different comp levers for outside board members. And one is for one-time equity. You can give annual equity. You can give one-time cash and then annual cash. And you can use these all in relationship to each other. So here are sort of what levers do you use, and this is a check all that apply, but you can see that the one-time equity only is the most prevalent. And then the next mix is annual cash and one-time equity. And so that's what's really important to understand is that you have to figure out and build. From my experience, I see that it's mainly the life science companies where they want cash because they're doctors by training or they're giving
Yes.
up something. Yeah.
Yeah, you'll see if you have a medical advisory board that they're giving up patient time and everything, that's where the cash component comes in that they want to see. So it is way more prevalent than if you just look at a general tech company.
Yeah, and it's the same vesting schedules for everybody. It's 4-year vesting with a 1-year cliff. And it's the same thing for the board members as well, the outside board members, unless you have someone coming in where you know that their time is finite on the board because they're there for a specific reason. And maybe you want to make the vesting, 2 years if in fact, there's a limited time that you want them to be on. So, Morgan, did you have something else you were going to add?
I do, because also when you participate in the private company compensation survey, you will be able to download a comp committee checklist. And that is a great resource for companies to have, especially when you are either putting your comp committee in place for the first time or you have closed a fundraising round and you need to look at your overall compensation for the organization.
You know,
And Joe,
yeah.
go ahead. I was going to say, we had a question come in saying, is this for the board of directors or just the advisory board?
Your board, it depends who's on your board, but it's not for your investor board members. Investor board members don't get additional equity. It's only outside board members. It could be also include your scientific advisory board. So I'm going to show you one other thing here on the let's see, the CEO, and I believe this is, hang on. Okay, so this is the CEO. We talked about the first time versus second time because I just want to focus on these levers here. So this is is this biotech, Morgan, or life sciences?
If it's not specified, it's going to be all.
Okay, less than 30 million in total financing. So
Yeah.
you can see first time, second time, third time CEO. We are assuming you're not going to be a second or third time CEO if you totally screwed up. And you can see the total cash is first time CEO, the second time gets to be more, and the third time even more than that. And then here is the total founder equity staying pretty consistent. And then the non-founder equity, you see the outside CEO who's had a second time and third time is asking for more. So that's really important to understand. And it also shows you that for any last part here, and then I know we'll wind up, any chiefs or VPs, you want to look by the job title, by the industry if it's appropriate, like maybe a CFO doesn't matter industry as much, and by your total financing. And then from the director level down, you want to put in some kind of pay plans, which is, Bill, what you were talking about, which is putting in ranges so that you can do a job leveling and you can look at the mix between total cash and equity. And here is a sample of this because we have these sort of pay plans. So here's a director pay plan, and you can see it falls into three levels: administrative, scientific, and technical. And that means your administrative people are like sales, marketing, HR, finance. And then the science people have a different pay plan from the technical people. And then here's the same kind of thing for a manager level. So the three areas are important: administrative, scientific, and technical. And then we also have like a specialist in support. And you can, design as much as you want or as little as you want. So at the top levels, chiefs and VPs, look by the job title in the industry and the total financing. And again, the industry may open up obviously you're not going to have a tech company having a chief medical officer, but it is good to look at maybe the difference between biotech versus medical device versus a healthcare services company. And then you can also look by where you are with your total financing now. And then you want to look at the next round because you want to see what the dilution is going to be and be able to look out on the horizon. Bill, any other thoughts on that? I feel like I've been speed talking here.
No, you've done a great job, Jody. I would just say that pay attention if you put the comp ranges in place, like you just suggested. Pay attention to them every year. It doesn't mean that you need to change them every year, and you certainly don't need to change them quarterly. But once a year, you really have to look at it, make sure they're still relevant. And I think that's where your data points really come in, and you could start to benchmark.
Yeah, well, the ranges are meant to use as a broad level so that you have people in relationship. You still would go and look at a specific job for the title. And this also does accounts, though, that for the percentiles, the 25th, 50th, and 75th, because you don't have to get yourself all crazy by trying to get to the exact job, the exact match, and also things like location, because all of that is really subject to change, right? Sometimes we see that the Bay Area is really hot. Other times we see Boston's really hot. Sometimes we see the Midwest is really hot. And there is no one location where you pay a premium for the cost of living. It depends on how desirable that job is and what the competition for talent is. Because, Morgan, maybe you can wind up with this. Talent is talent, right?
Yeah, you pay top dollar for top talent, regardless of where you are. And on our platform, at least, you can customize by a number of different filters. But really, we say that the total amount of financing, which is how Jody kicked this off, is really the MVP of all filters because it's the most consistent and reliable way to look at the compensation data.
Don't make yourself crazy. You really want to have a plan. The data is there to help give you the speed limit and tell you road conditions, and then you decide how fast you want to go, whether this person is the Ferrari on your team or who that candidate is, and you make the decisions, at least, on balance to have a holistic model. So with
Absolutely.
that, I know we're at 1:30, and if you have questions, we don't send the deck out because we're sort of, holding you hostage to participate because we want your data and we want you to have data, and we will send out a recording. And if you have any questions, just let us know.
Perfect. And Bill, thank you
Uh,
for joining us too.
Thank you. Thanks, Morgan and Jody. And thanks for everybody that joined today.
Yes, thanks
Appreciate it.
everybody. Bye.